It's like the biggest emotional and psychological firestorm you can set off in someone. Asking the question, is there something out there that loves me unconditionally? And being disappointed feels terrifying. The Gen Z that are coming through are very much in that incredibly fragile, no economic security, no sense that the climate is safe, identity politics, high terror. And for that generation, I'm just seeing a hunger for somewhere to steady themselves. We might have hit bottom with millennials in terms of belief in God, that some of the data looks like Gen Z might tick back up again. Whether or not the church can respond in a way that is able to not be scared of them is the question. You literally come to see humans as machines. And this is where Iain McGilchrist is so helpful. A bunch of people in my life have taken psychedelics, and that is causing a lot of them to really question whether the world is wholly material.
They're not saying, let's all put psychedelics on the next alpha course.
It is a really strong and common reaction to a very unstable world for those in their late teens and 20s to be drawn to Marxists, because it sounds like the only way we're going to survive this is together. And the kind of like dismissive tone to that longing can be hugely off-putting. I have qualms about the way that Trump uses Christianity. We need to take extremely seriously the damage of the church's political project to its missional aim. When we get into the anxiety thing of like defend our space, defend our values, it really breaks my heart how harmful it can be. The key blocker, the key reason that they'll look everywhere else except the church is...
I'm joined now by Elizabeth Oldfield, who is the host of the Sacred Podcast, which comes from Theos. She's former director of Theos as well. And she's the author of Fully Alive, Tending to the Soul in Turbulent Times. Elizabeth, lovely to see you.
It's really nice to talk to you, Justin.
I wanted to bring you on to talk about your sense of what's going on at the moment. I've written a book and I'm currently hosting a podcast that makes the somewhat optimistic claim that maybe we're seeing the turning of the tide of faith in the West, that maybe there's a new openness to God and faith and religion that sort of is rather different to the new atheism that once seemed to be at the top of the pecking order. You've very kindly read the book and reviewed it, and I thought you had some really excellent feedback on what you were reading there. Just in general, what do you think of that thesis, this idea that perhaps there is a new openness, let's say, towards Christianity, given the waning of new atheism and so on?
Yeah, it's a big question. And in order to answer it, I have to sort of try and shake off my former think tank director persona, because we are definitely more in the realm of kind of hunches and speculation at this stage. But I need to say I was just really glad you'd written the book. I think it needed saying that it does feel like there's something in the air, that there is a sense in which the conversations, the longings, the metaphysical yearnings of a generation are closer to the surface than perhaps the last generations were. I do generally feel more optimistic about that. I have a very strange calling, which is to be mainly out from the church, where I would, be at home, where I would anchor myself in conversations with people who might never walk over the threshold, activists, spiritual seekers of all kinds of stripes, artists, and often find myself in those settings as the kind of soul out religious person. And I have definitely noticed over the last few years the numbers of those willing to sidle up to me and say, could you just explain to me, what does it mean to be a Christian? Or what's this whole Jesus thing about? Or, I had one guy come up and say, I've been doing Buddhist meditation for 20 years. And recently, every time I meditate, Jesus shows up and I don't know what to do with it. So yes, anecdotally, I would be very much on the same page as you. I also, your listeners won't find this too weird, but I have been feeling this sense of something's on the turn, something's on the change. You put it so beautifully about a sense that either the tide's on its way back in, or you can hear that moment where it stops going out. And someone said to me the other day about their little village church, we have to sort it out now. We have to sort out all these big structural things that have to be done, because we'll be the last congregation that is able to do that. And something in my spirit went, no, you won't. No, you won't. like deep down in my knower, I don't think that's true. So that's not evidence.
That's no, it's not.
I've learned to trust those things.
Well, that's right. And the only facts and figures I could provide in the book were obviously of terminal decline. Everything going the opposite direction, and frequently were. Only this morning someone was tweeting back at me, "Haven't you seen the figures, Dustin?" Well, yeah, of course I have. I talk about them in the book. It's obvious where the direction is in the West, but. Yeah, I guess my thesis is this optimistic, albeit somewhat anecdotal one, that there's something changing. It feels like the way people are open to having these conversations in a way they weren't before. I don't know whether you put as much kind of emphasis on the new atheist sort of coming and going as I do. What do you think? How much do you think that has played into it? That my feeling is there has been a sense in which that movement kind of waning in public consciousness and it almost failing to give really any significant long-lasting answers has sort of changed the space and opened it up for people to kind of think, okay, that didn't work. I'm allowed to maybe think about God again in a way that I wasn't sort of given intellectual permission for before. What do you think?
So I definitely think the increasing absence of contempt towards those who express metaphysical yearnings is a definite factor. We are social creatures. We are influenced by our peers. Some fragile childhood part of us still wants to be cool, I think, in the eyes of the people that we respect. And when you've got very high social status people in public being incredibly derisive about the possibility of a loving God, it makes a big difference. I think what I would say is that I am very with you on increased spiritual openness. And I think there's a few things driving that. One is the sense of kind of impending climate collapse, the mood music about where we are in terms of keeping global temperatures in a safe zone for us, really particularly for my generation and down, is so much part of their formation of like the when they think about the future, when they think about what's possible in life, what's good, what kind of person they want to be, the potential that we have essentially set fire to our only home is psychologically formative. It's very, very significant. I think that that is why when I pushed back on you a little bit in the review, is that's the bit that I think. Well, let me finish my point. The spiritual openness I see in that generation is partly coming from a sense of climate. It's partly coming from what we see around people like Jordan Peterson, just changing the language about what it means to be kind of intellectually alert and interested in ideas. That's no longer seen as in conflict necessarily with being interested in religion. I do perceive huge spiritual openness. I think whether or not the church can respond to that openness in a way that is genuinely invitational, that genuinely hears the concerns and the longings of a spiritually open generation and knows how to tell our story in a way that makes sense to them, and frankly is able to not be scared of them, which is what I see a lot of in the church, is the question for me. Whether this will actually translate into a bunch of people falling into the arms of a loving God, which would make me so full of joy, but that I don't know.
Just talk to me a little bit more. I know it's anecdotal, but about the people you're bumping into and what's changed in terms of, I guess, the sort of people looking for spirituality has existed for a long time. There's, throughout the sort of 80s and 90s, really from the 60s, I suppose, there's been a sort of an interest in Eastern spirituality and sort of, looking, in all those different areas for something. You mentioned those sort of people kind of almost saying they're still giving Christianity a second look. Where do you think that's coming from? What's sort of motivating people in that way?
I think for a lot of them, the kind of shift in the generations means we've got people coming through with less baggage. So it's actually happening quite differently depending on which generation you look at and actually which gender you look at, I think, and politically. But there's a kind of, I have a strange ministry to middle-aged men having midlife metaphysical crises for whatever reason. God often puts me in the path of men in their 30s and 40s and 50s often, but not uniquely, who had some kind of Christianity in their childhood, rejected it because for intellectual reasons or whatever. A lot of them have gone and done a lot of meditation. They've, done Stoicism. You could look at Paul Kingsnorth's story, which you write about in the book. Looked everywhere else except the place they started. And then in that lovely T.S. Eliot thing, is to come round and know the place where we began for the first time. I'm seeing a lot of that kind of actually, how do I live, impending mortality, much healthier response to the kind of midlife sense of your own mortality than buying a red Ferrari is going, actually, maybe I'm going to go to church. And I'm like, yay. The trouble with that group is that often they hover. They are hyper-intellectualized often. They're listening to John Vervaeke, they're listening to Iain McGilchrist, they're listening to Jordan Peterson, they're doing mindfulness, they might have tried some psychedelics. We can get onto that because that crosses the left-right divide. I spoke to Matthew Taylor on my podcast years ago and he said, look, I'm convinced of the value of Christianity for societies. I'm even convinced of the value of it for individuals, but I just can't get there. And there is a lot of men who I pray for and I talk to and I'm friends with, where actually that moment of surrender, I don't know anything about Jordan Peterson's personal spiritual life, but it's one way you could narrate that. You get it all intellectually, but you just sit on the fence trying to make the Rubik's Cube work so that it doesn't feel risky to get on your knees. And that's a sadness. And I think it's only if the church is able to walk alongside people in that moment and invite them into, like at some point, you have to stop thinking you can make all of this make sense in your head.
That's so interesting to hear. And just, you perfectly expressed what I probably didn't express so well in the book, which is just, yes, it's this, so many people seem to be hovering on the edge, but it's kind of, there is this, it goes beyond the intellectual at some point. There's this kind of sense of surrender that I think is still always going to be difficult for some personalities to do. But that's interesting. You say, you've developed this interesting ministry to these types of people. I can imagine who some of those people are that you've been engaging with. But they're not the only demographic that you're finding. And in all honesty, and I think this was a very valid critique, I tend to focus on that demographic you've just described more in the book than any other. What are some of the others that you're seeing, perhaps though coming from, who are of a different gender, a different kind of political persuasion and everything else, that you think are nevertheless part of this wider movement?
Yeah, so I think it's entirely fair that you would have focused on them because there are individuals who'd be more open about their stories, as individuals like that tend to be.
Yes.
Because they have confidence and platforms. But I would say that the Gen Z that are coming through are very much in that incredibly fragile, no economic security, no sense that the climate is safe. Identity politics creates this very strange landscape to navigate in terms of how you find yourself and how you choose what your life is going to be and where you steady yourself. I don't want to just kind of dump all over it because I think that there are some things in that moment that Christians should listen to and see something of the liberatory spirit of Jesus in. But overall, it's a pretty unstable place to grow up. And for that generation, I'm just seeing a hunger for somewhere to stand, somewhere to steady themselves, anything to give their lives a sense of, John Vervaeke talks about the meaning crisis, in any way to kind of locate themselves in anything beyond this. Zygmunt Bauman calls it liquid modernity, this kind of sloshing and unstable mix of narratives and information and choices. And that I think that's, we're only just beginning to see that. But on some of the graphs, you can see the kind of, that we might have hit bottom with millennials in terms of belief in God, that some of the data looks like Gen Z might be beginning to tick back up again. And certainly what you're seeing is like widespread acceptance of astrology, much more sense of basically, take what you can get. We're not going to pour scorn on you for finding meaning anywhere, whatever it is, like an assumption that people will be spiritual rather than that being a sort of strange niche interest. So So yes, I think for that generation, there is a tenderness and a fragility that I think just I feel God's heart for. But because they also tend to have, strong views around identity, come across as quite spiky sometimes, it's really easy for the church to, one, pour scorn on them, which I think is not just counterproductive, but actively sinful. And two, not know how to meet them where they are. There's a really interesting person writing called Lamorna Ash. She has a column in the New Statesman. I've got to know her a little bit. She did a piece in The Guardian about two priests who had become, two priests who had been stand-up comics, no religious background, both converted and had become Christians and then priests. And she has a book coming out next year because she is from this precise generation. She's fiercely bright, wonderful, and was so puzzled by her friends becoming Christians that she's gone and interviewed a bunch of people from this generation who've been converting. And so I'm so looking forward to that book to kind of help us get our heads around that. I would say the key blocker is sexuality. The key reason that they'll look everywhere else except the church is an assumption that they, and a much higher proportion of them would identify as queer, will not be welcome. Just like off the bat, you are not welcome because you are either self-described as queer or your friends are queer. And therefore, it's like oil and water. These two things cannot mix. And that is this enormous problem for those of us who would love them to know how loved they are.
It's so interesting to hear you describe that sort of that demographic and the sort of the things that are driving them. I suppose, I very much resonate with what you described there as this sense of being unmoored in this kind of liquid modernity, the meaning crisis, to give it another title. To what extent, I don't have a kind of very thought out or detailed idea. It's just a kind of hunch that and having read, others who are talking about this, that this idea that I sketch out in the book, that the Christian story did, at least for many people and many generations, provide that kind of sense of stability and rootedness and a story to live into. And the fact that people now, generally speaking, don't feel like they have that story, and they're floating around and with lots of possibilities of how to invent themselves in today's world. I think it was actually reading, especially Alan Noble. He talked about the burden that exists, he sees on young people, especially to kind of invent themselves from scratch. And this, he kind of saw this as one of the reasons why there's this anxiety and depression, because people aren't made to kind of to do that. It kind of creates this intolerable burden, especially in the social media age, when you're constantly being effectively judged by everyone around you as to how successfully you're presenting yourself, and your identity and everything else. And my kind of simple thought is, well, maybe these are the conditions under which a stable narrative like the Christian story starts to look attractive to people again. That suddenly they think, well, what if there's a story that exists that has given people that sense of stability and identity and purpose? What are your thoughts on that? That's kind of my little thesis in the book. I don't know whether you think that works or what your thoughts are on it.
Yeah, that's my hope. I think I become more and more confident with every passing year of not just that God exists and loves us, but of the treasure of our tradition, of the just like sane and humane and kind of psychologically sound basis that being involved in healthy and generous and open churches gives you. And when the church can sometimes at Theos we talked about confident non-defensiveness. When we can know that we are loved deeply enough and that we are safe, crucially, because I feel like the whole culture is in low-level fight or flight at the moment, as is the church, and that makes us defensive and scornful and dismissive and protective and tribal. If we can deal with that, as the New Testament seems to me to be continually inviting us to, then we can open our arms and say, just come join us, come share, come walk alongside us for a bit. The thing that I have landed on as certainly the thing I am called to do, whether it is useful more broadly, I don't know, is lower the barriers. Because we tend to start with do you accept Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior?
Mm-hmm.
Or, and I know we know this and we've heard a million sermons on it, but it's really hard for it to land. Or you need to sort out my perceived problems with your lifestyle, sexuality. I don't think this is true, but this is what people hear. Attitude to trans people, complete lack of care about the environment. I'm talking here about the Gen Z concerns, the barriers for them. If we can start with, and this is what we've been trying to do in our little community, do you want to come pray Compline with us? Or, you might find the concept of the Imago Dei really helpful. I'm not saying you have to sign up to the whole thing, but maybe if you could think of yourself as an image of the divine, it might help stabilize your identity a little bit in a world that is telling you that you have to create it for yourself. Or, any of these treasures that we hold about generosity, about community, about ritual. And it's very easy for those from the outside, and Alan de Botton did this cleverly and well, to go, right, we're going to asset strip the treasures of Christianity and use it in our big undifferentiated soup of spiritual practices. And therefore we go, no, you must take the whole, you must start with the cross and then you can get to Sabbath.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if actually that's the wrong way around. If we say it's totally fine to not know what you think about God and have some concerns about the institution and not even know who you're praying to, but just try it, see what happens. And that might be what's required to recreate the imaginative space for the possibility that there is something behind all this.
I love that. Hi, Justin here. Hope you're enjoying the conversation. Just to say, if you'd like a free chapter of my book, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, I'll send it to you when you join my newsletter. Just visit justinbrierley.com. The link is with the info below. Now, back to the conversation. I mean, it'd be interesting just to get your thoughts on some of the figures I do cover, a number of whom you have interviewed as well and have taken an interest in some of their journeys and so on. Tom Holland is someone I got to know reasonably well over the last few years and just has been on a fascinating intellectual journey himself, but also I think he's been quite open in various spaces about the sort of the spiritual journey he's been on and the fact that in some moments he can sort of sign up to it all, Other moments, he describes it as a pail of cold water gets dashed across him and he thinks, of course none of it's true. I'm fooling myself here. What's your general thought on the Tom Holland phenomenon, let's say, of someone who's come to obviously appreciate how deeply our moral instincts have been shaped by the Christian story, and the way he's been talking about that in public?
I mean, I just think Tom's delightful, isn't he? And I hadn't realised quite how enormous the Rest is History podcast is.
Oh, it's huge.
But that I think is just in terms of kind of subtle and unforced and non kind of Machiavellian it's not even an approach, not even deliberate, but a sense of kind of a cultural apologetic happening. Someone who is just smart and funny in public, who also happens to be warm towards the contribution of the Christian faith. It just shows how far we've moved past the new atheist moment. And I think we shouldn't undervalue that kind of very gentle changing of the social imaginary. So Tom is also an old friend of Theos and someone that we've walked with. And I do think that, that group that we talked about at the beginning, these maybe not solely male, but maybe on average more male, kind of people who are drawn by the intellectual resources that the tradition offers. And they do tend to be temperamentally conservative, if not politically conservative, I would guess. Or, if you could look at Jonathan Haidt's kind of moral taste buds, with a longing for something beyond individual choice and freedom. In general, I think, at least in theory, more communitarian leaning than individualistic, although actually I think that fails to show up in a lot of their lives, maybe as fully as they would like it to, because of the way they've been formed as highly intellectual men. That someone like Tom Holland is just a wonderful conversation partner for them, whether they know him or not. And what I really value about Tom is his honesty. You know, there are a lot of people in the space kind of making positive noises about Christianity for intellectual reasons, whether they've come by psychology or history or just like the social science of the fact that we are getting further and further apart, and without, you know, robust forms of moral community, we don't thrive. He says, you know, I'm going to church. Some days I would say, you know, as you said, you know, I'm there, and some days I wouldn't. I mean, frankly, I think that's true of most of us who are, you know, publicly. Like, I have complete days like that where I'm like, this just sort of slides out of focus. It's like someone turns the glasses at the opticians. I'm like, wait, I can't see it. Why did I think this was a thing? What have I built my life on? But then I go, as I think Tom does, this still feels healthier. This still feels more human. I'm still going to get up and go to church because it will help me become the kind of person I want to be becoming, and it is better for my soul, even though if today I don't even know if I believe in my soul.
It's interesting because when I did have a fairly in-depth conversation with him about sort of where he's at, he talked about and this was all on record, the fact that he just finds the Christian story more interesting than the sort of atheist materialist account of reality. He finds sort of secular humanism anemic and boring and shallow and uninteresting. And even though it's kind of weird and mysterious and crazy in parts, the Christian story, he says he just finds it far more interesting. You know, he would love that story to be true, basically. And I don't know, like, I just wonder, sort of, I almost get the sense with some of the folk that we're profiling here, it is as much a kind of a sense of what they want to be true, a kind of an aesthetic appeal to something, regardless of exactly where the evidence, strictly speaking, points in that sense. I don't know if you get that sense.
Yeah, I mean, it really depends how you define evidence, right? And this is where Iain McGilchrist, who's another person you could put in this space, is so helpful, because I'm so sorry, all of my thoughts are connected. I have got to the point where I think the intellectual can get you so far, but then a lot of people get stuck. And that's not to denigrate the kind of intellectual forms of apologetics, but that it is only with a sense of experience and encounter that most people I know are able to go, yes, you know, I surrender to this God. But that sense of encounter is much more difficult for some people than others, and it really depends on your formation. And so Iain McGilchrist's theory, the kind of hemisphere hypothesis about basically what you pay attention to becomes all that you can see, is really helpful. And for a certain generation, a certain depending on what you've spent your life doing, you have developed a form of attention that is very left hemispheric, that is quite narrow, concrete, linear. I mean, I think Daniel Dennett is the key example of this, like, to complete excess in a quite troubling way. You know, that you literally come to see the world and humans as machines. And I think, therefore, one of the responses to this moment is to invite people, rather than saying, well, pray and you will know the love of God instantly. It's literally maybe not possible, because anything is possible in God, but really difficult. And so anything that helps people develop those right hemispheric forms of attention, you know, Iain McGilchrist basically says it becomes how you encounter the world. If you're able to get that kind of more whole, imaginative, holistic, connected, embodied, emotional, you know, ritual, practice-based ways of approaching the world, you might over time actually be able to encounter and experience that which is beyond you more than you would have otherwise. And so that's my sort of prescription for a lot of people in those situations, is just like, go to church. It's what Pascal says at the end of his wager. Go to church.
Try it.
Get out of your intellectual agony just go to church. He doesn't really say like wager on hell or heaven. Just says go to church.
Yeah. I suppose it's that old thing of sometimes. What is it? I understand because I believe. You had to enter into something and look at it from the inside before you get the full picture of what it is you're dealing with, and it's never just some intellectual set of arguments in the end. I mean, just sticking with Iain McGilchrist for a moment. Again, he's someone I've had the privilege of also engaging with once or twice, and it's so interesting because again, I think he himself has come to to essentially some sort of theistic belief, though even that is starting to put it in very left hemisphere terms, which he'd tell you off for, because you're sort of categorizing and trying to nail down exactly what he believes about God. But nonetheless, I think it's fair to say he believes there's a sort of transcendent source, if you like, beyond us and to the universe and to meaning and consciousness and everything else. Though he said, I am not a Christian. I'm not, and though he did say, though I can hardly think of a more beautiful mythos than the Christian story to describe God. So what do you think? I mean, what's so often these characters are sort of sitting somewhere in the middle, aren't they? They're not exactly themselves necessarily embracing Orthodox Christian faith, but they certainly seem to be a gateway, perhaps, to kind of people taking the possibility seriously. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I think that's creating space, creating permission. A lot of this is about the permission to say, I really wish there was a loving God. You know, that's such a vulnerable and raw thing. I think I always talk about, when I'm talking to people about my faith, feeling a very strong duty of care, because it's like the biggest emotional and psychological firestorm you can set off in someone. Most people who don't know what they believe in God keep it in a very tight, fireproof box, because asking the question, is there something out there that loves me unconditionally, and being disappointed feels terrifying. And so to just create a space in public where more people are saying, I long for this. This feels like something I'm made for. I don't know fully how to make it make sense, is a beautiful thing. And honestly, I think that those in that space who are sincere, who are able to get to that place of surrender of the self, of getting over the pride, and I say that not judgmentally because I struggle with that too, we'll get there. Like it feels like a healthy direction of travel to me. Where it begins to feel unhealthy is where that space wants to claim Christianity as an identity marker, or very specifically as an excluding thing that is used to bash other people about the head and look down on them. And I don't think people who have surrendered their life to Jesus get to do that. I especially don't think people who have not surrendered their lives to Jesus get to use him as a cosh to bash other people with. Yeah.
And I suppose, you know, you're taking us in the directions these movements could go. I think it's all a bit sort of mixed up, but you've got, I think, people who are kind of being drawn by Christianity at a personal and spiritual level, as well as seeing the benefits it has brought to the West and what we might be losing in the absence of the Christian story. And perhaps there are those who are more simply concerned with structuring culture and society in the way that they feel is most beneficial. They have a more conservative bent, and the Judeo-Christian sort of story sort of fits that. It's a useful way to kind of come back to, you know,
to co-opt.
Yeah. So I'm hearing that, and I sense it myself, that there's a danger here that we can think, yay, Christianity is being talked about again, but there's also the danger that it's simply being co-opted for another kind of idolatry in a way.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And I really do. It's why I'm kind of pretty sure that we're seeing higher spiritual openness, not at all sure that will translate. I mentioned in the review of your book that I see, on the left, people like Patricia Lockwood and Sally Rooney, both their most recent novels had really high existential yearning at surface level. And particularly Sally Rooney's has this Catholic character who the protagonist just is like, how are you this now in Ireland in the decade that we're in? And over the course of the book, just you can hear her being like, oh, that actually looks really lovely. But, I'm a woman. All my friends are gay. And the rhetoric coming out of the churches is it can be hugely off-putting. And I really, really fear, it feels like we've slightly turned an unhelpful corner in the UK church to be beginning to take on some more of that cultural positioning that the US church, I think, has really unhelpfully, or segments of the US church really unhelpfully fallen into for decades. And I just cannot say strongly enough, as someone who is like out and about, listening to people in kind of post-liberal and conservative circles, but also, and perhaps more unusually, in progressive, environmental, activist circles, how much the public rhetoric from the church of institutional failure, political power grab, like the way we talk about gender and sexuality issues, how much it just like stops dead in their tracks, what seems to me to be like a wind of the spirit blowing. And some of them are able to get over it, because I've seen various people come from very atheist perspectives to really being in a place where they would probably call themselves Christians, but it's because they found bits of the church that they feel are welcoming to them. The contemplative traditions tend to be places they can go. But yeah, I think we need to take extremely seriously the damage of the church's political project to its missional aims, or not all of the church's political project, but that like when we get into the anxiety thing of like defend our space, defend our values, it really breaks my heart how harmful it can be.
Yeah. Tell me a bit more about some of those authors, Patricia Lockwood, Sally Rooney. What do you sense they are getting at? What are they part of this? Do you feel that they are symptomatic of this new openness potentially, even though there are these significant barriers in terms of the way the cultural baggage that often comes with the church, and whether people could ever feel like that could be the place where they could call home in the end?
Yeah, I'd say even though they're probably both millennials, they seem to me to be the voice that I was speaking about. I mean, and all of these are sort of arbitrary categories anyway, but the more Gen Z kind of high irony, high terror, and a lot of them are Marxists. It is a really strong, and common reaction to a very unstable world for those in their late teens and 20s to be drawn to Marxist political project, because it sounds like the only way we're going to survive this is together. And it's extremely utopian. It's extremely it gives people a story, it gives people a sense of belonging, it gives people a structure. And again, the kind of like dismissive tone to that longing, or the even very hostile and aggressive tone to that intuition in people, is again a real blocker. But as I've thought about it, I've been like, what is the way forward with this? Is it that those who are kind of politically post-liberal leaning or conservative leaning are able to be in conversation with those in those tribes who are having this increased sense of spiritual openness, and those who are more progressive leaning or left leaning politically are able to kind of minister and walk with? We just chaplain the people in our networks and around us, and that's okay. I have this weird thing where I have never taken psychedelics, but a bunch of people in my life have taken psychedelics as part of this, again, huge cultural upsurge, and that is causing a lot of them to really question whether the world is wholly immaterial and what might that mean. And we just minister to the people that we happen to be called to, and that's fine. I do think, though, that the people in the post-liberal, more conservative, more intellectualized, that stream that's feeding in to this spiritual openness, more readily hear stuff from the church that makes them feel like they would be welcome than those over here do, but they are no less real and no less loved.
The surprising rebirth of belief in God has been making waves since its launch. Now you can listen to all of Season 1. Discover the story of why new atheism grew old and secular thinkers are considering Christianity again. Featuring interviews with leading thinkers across the faith spectrum, you'll learn the inside account of the rise and fall of new atheism. All 30 episodes of Season 1 of The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God are available now. Find out why we've become a #1 ranked religion and spirituality podcast when you jump in at episode 1. Go to justinbrierley.com/surprisingrebirth to subscribe on your favourite podcast platform. That's justinbrierley.com.
That's a fascinating area which I never really opened up in my book, only just referenced briefly once or twice, the psychedelic aspect of this. And that's interesting because in a way you do normally associate that maybe with the left kind of, progressive hippie sort of generation or whatever. Whereas actually, interestingly, quite a few people on the conservative right, the Joe Rogans and so on, are also talking a lot about this and so on. So what's going on there? What's that all about, would you say?
Yeah. I mean, I would love to do more work on it because I don't feel like an expert, but I do feel like what for those who haven't followed it, what's kind of happened in the psychedelic world is that you saw a huge flowering in the 60s where there was a similar moment of huge spiritual openness, post-war, but also Vietnam, a sense in which the old world was passing away, the future was uncertain. Also huge flowering of communitarianism in that time, these hungers for something else.
And I think that did have its Christian wave in the Jesus People movement, arguably, where it was a lot of these folks who were part of the, tune in, drop out, but then found Jesus was the ultimate drug or whatever. So I think almost there was a way in which the church sort of rode that wave a bit, of the 1960s, wasn't there?
Yeah, and I think having that kind of that cultural fluency, that ability to be with people where they are and not look down on them, but go and listen and be alongside, that again and again, I think is what we're called to. That psychedelic moment, because it was one of the many things about that moment that caused a lot of harm, kind of went underground for a while. People have used them all the way through. But what's changed is they have come to a lot of scientific attention as possible therapeutic, in therapeutic uses, and now have very highly evidenced in their use for depression, for eating disorders. I feel like I need to not overclaim in these because I haven't gone and looked in detail at the study, but my understanding is that there is a huge upsurge in interest in them in therapeutic use, which has basically given them a credibility that they didn't have before. And those who are longing for meaning and belonging and kind of more in their lives, but feel skeptical about the theistic stance, who want to keep things in a broadly kind of materialist frame. And so they've done mindfulness and they've done a load of yoga and they're starting to do biohacking and are constantly trying to improve themselves. Psychedelics is often a way of, it's talked about as a very functional thing, it's a way of dealing with trauma, or it's a way of increasing your openness, or whatever it is. And for some people, that is what they are. They are basically medicine, whether used legally or illegally. But then a lot of people that I think the unexpected consequence is, oh, wait, there's more in the world than I thought there was. There's more in the universe. And that's being, channeled in what we might call this sort of slightly tricky label of New Age ways. There's lots of retreats and rituals and all those kind of things. But even in that space, I think there's a sense of, where's the community? Where's the rigor? Where's the long-lastingness? How is this not just sort of an individual project of personal enlightenment, but something that reaches beyond me? And that's the moment when people go, maybe religion.
Yeah. But it's almost, in a funny way, by sort of being a shortcut to a transcendent experience. It does seem to awaken the possibility in a certain number of people, even if it's not in and of itself actually the way to fully benefit from that. As you say, it's a kind of for me, it is a bit like a shortcut, and potentially something where you don't necessarily know what you're dealing with either. You're kind of just opening yourself up to something, whatever it may look like, and you can have good trips, but you can have bad trips, and there's a sort of a sense of it's sort of, you don't really know what you're ultimately going to find at the end of that road.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, there's a sense, whether you think it's a good or a bad thing, it's evidence that there's something more than just chemistry going on here. Is that your sense of the psychedelic thing?
I mean, I don't know if I have never done it, so I don't know. I don't know if people would describe it as evidence. It's more like, okay, so what I'm about to say is a hypothesis rather than anything that I can back up. But when people narrate it to me, it sounds, again, connected to the hemisphere hypothesis. It feels like it shifts them from a lifetime of formation in left hemispheric ways of how do I take this thing apart, linear, concrete, inanimate, left hemispheric forms of attention, and somehow strengthens the connections with the right hemispheric forms of attention, which help us see the whole, help us see what's beyond us, help us see relations between things, help us perceive and sense. Yeah. The thing is, as soon as you start talking about right hemispheric forms of attention, the language stops working because it's not a particularly language-based form of attention. So it's really hard. But yeah, my sense is that as I said earlier about right hemispheric forms of attention maybe being a way to make it possible for people to even accept the possibility of the love of God, that psychedelics is actually one of the things that do that. And that's uncomfortable for Christians. And knowing what's good and bad about it, or how God might even be using it to even ask that question, But
I literally know people though who would say, well, I'm a Christian today, but my entryway was psychedelics. It opened me up to the possibility of God. Now they're not saying, therefore, let's all put psychedelics on the next Alpha course, but I think it's just a kind of, it's just the reality of it, whether you like it or not, whether it fits your moral standards or not. This was the way in which, for me, in our broken world, God got through to me. So that's it. You've been so kind with your time, and there's so much more we perhaps could have spoken about. But I think your perspective on this has just been really helpful in helping me to give me a bit of a wider picture, of what this movement looks like. I'm excited in a way because when I submitted the manuscript a year or more ago to the publisher, and just had the opportunity to do a few tweaks really thereafter, what was frustrating was I kept bumping into more and more people and more kind of examples of this. And if I was to write it again, there'd be a bunch more people I'd be including and talking about. And I think
it's for the next book, Justin.
Yeah, absolutely. But quite rightly, you've also outlined, hey, it's not just happening with all these interesting conservative men over here, Justin. There's actually just an interesting sort of thing going on. I think the challenge, as you say quite rightly, Elizabeth, is the danger for the church is kind of trying to sort of position itself with either tribe or whatever.
Yeah.
Rather than just recognizing that all of this is saying people need God, they need to be part of this bigger story. But how do we not sort of simply enter the same culture wars that are so often, manifesting around these things, and actually try to transcend them? And that's really difficult, actually, because it's so tempting to just sort of get on the bandwagon. But then I think you miss the bigger picture somehow, don't you?
Yeah. And I think we have to really pay attention to that instinct in ourselves to be affirmed. And I spoke to Andy Crouch on The Sacred during the whole Trump moment. And I do think, you may have listeners who are Trump voters, and I'm very interested in what's behind that. I don't want to kind of pour contempt on everyone who felt like that was the right option. But I have qualms about the way that Trump uses Christianity. And I said, why do you think he's been so powerful? And he said, he made people who had felt overlooked feel valued. He said, and I think he quoted an earlier Reagan thing where he said, you might not be able to endorse me, but I endorse you. And that need in us for someone to say you're okay can be used against us and can be a temptation. And so when someone in public says something nice about Christianity, I think we really need to stay alert to what's going on character-wise and what they might be saying about other people that Jesus wouldn't say, and what that might mean. So that, yes, that like letting ourselves be seduced is dangerous.
Yeah. I agree. It's a huge danger, and the thing to remember is that all of these people are human. None of them are, you know, they may have some really good points, they may have some really interesting ideas, but they're not. They will not be the salvation of the world. That's for sure. But so interesting to chat with you, Elizabeth. Thank you so much. Elizabeth's new book, Fully Alive, is now available to buy, and if people want to get hold of the Sacred podcast, I guess they can just go and look for it wherever they get their podcast from.
Yep. Should pop up.
Great.
And I've really enjoyed speaking to you. Thank you, Justin.
Oh, thank you so much for the time. God bless.
You too.
Well, Elizabeth Oldfield mentioned the influence that secular historian Tom Holland has been having on raising awareness of the role of Christianity in shaping the West. So how about hearing from the man himself? Check out my interview with Tom Holland in this video next. And you can visit justinbrierley.com for signed copies of my books, a free chapter with the newsletter, and to support my work through Patreon or US tax-deductible giving. Supporters can get free signed copies, early access, bonus content, and monthly catch-up calls with me. That's justinbrierley.com.